So yeah, hello. I think we're live. Thanks to everyone for joining on YouTube and on Zoom. Really excited for this. Danielle, thanks for coming in today and speaking on your career path and sort of how you got into VC. We haven't had a speaker touch on VC as a career yet, and so really looking forward to this. Danielle has experience at CBS, Google, but got there from like a liberal arts major, which is something that I think a lot of us are wondering maybe if our major doesn't align with exactly what we want to do, or how do we sort of be flexible. And so excited to hear about your path, and then after your presentation, get into a Q&A with our students. So welcome to Xoogler School, and thanks for presenting. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, James, and hi, everybody. Really excited to be here. I am happy to talk about my experience as an art history major at Whitman College and now as a partner at Cherubic Ventures. So I understand most of you are juniors and seniors. I've customized my thoughts to hopefully resonate with where you are right now in your career, but happy to go into more specifics during a Q&A. I only have about 10 slides to go through. So a little bit of background on me. Let's see, I went to Whitman College. It's a small school in Walla Walla, Washington. There are about 1,500 students. And I majored in art history, studied abroad in Florence, was an intern at the D. Young Museum here in San Francisco. Thought I wanted to be a curator, but was a docent for a summer and worked with one of the permanent exhibitions. And when I was in college, I majored simply in what I thought was interesting. And to be totally honest, I had zero career goals or visions, no long-term plans. I have 2 kids now, so I sort of cringe as I hear myself saying this, because I would, I can see myself being heavy-handed with my own kids, telling them what to do and where to go. But for me, I just wanted to learn. And I took a modern and contemporary art class and thought it was fascinating. And I thought to myself, I could enjoy learning about that for 4 years. And that was the end of my analysis. And while in college, I took a ton of different classes, women in Africa, econ, psych, just to expose myself to as many different disciplines as possible, and concluded art history was really fascinating, and that's what I decided to get my major in. After that, it was 2008. There was a recession. It was a really challenging time, but I landed a job at CBS television, and again, had nothing to do with art history, but really fascinating because I wrote paid programming. I actually wrote commercials. I wrote a couple 30-minute overnight paid programming. I got on local TV a few times. It was a bit embarrassing, but really just exposed myself to a super traditional and competitive industry. I was the youngest on the floor. I was almost often the only female in the newsroom, in these business meetings, but I learned to hustle. I drove up and down 101 with a tape recorder at the time because we didn't have iPhones, talking to myself about every business I saw as I drove up and down 101, and then would go back to the office, call those businesses, work with them, and then write their commercials, and of course conclude the sale. I learned a lot, mainly just how to fend for myself, and it was a commission-only job, and it was at times really, really challenging to pay the bills. But because of that, I was super, super focused, and just learned the importance of strong communication and hard work. Took that to, at first, a sales job at Google. And I was at Google for almost 8 years. And when I was at Google, I started doing new business sales as an account executive, but I didn't do that very long. as an individual contributor. I quickly moved into people management, and from there I continued to build and was working with early stage startups at the time. Those startups at the time were tiny companies called Spotify and Uber and Blue Apron. Those were some of the companies that my team at Google was working with after they raised early capital to help them spend and build their brand on Google. So I did that as an individual contributor. I did that for many years, leading the team that secured those relationships and generated that revenue. And while at Google, I also did a few other fun things. I worked with female entrepreneurs in emerging markets as a global program manager through a rotation program that Google had. I was a mentor for entrepreneurs in emerging markets through a program called Black Box Connect. I built brand new sales teams. I interviewed and hired 500 plus people. I worked with marketing, I worked with contractors to help with our new business efforts. And in the last few years at Google, I managed a technical support team. We processed millions of tickets 24 hours a day, 5 days a week in every time zone in the world across 10 languages and multiple channels, text, video, email. And so I left the new business revenue ad side of the house and went to working under the hood. How does Google provide the superior streamlined support across the 200 plus ad products we had? At that point, I had thought to myself, okay, I've done a really good job at Google optimizing for learning. I'm among one of the best companies in the world, and I wanted to get exposure to as much as possible. So I kept taking on new projects. I kept challenging myself to take advantage of every rotational opportunity or opportunity for increased scope. And after a while, I realized, okay, now I have a little bit more clarity on what I like and what I don't like. And I felt the need to shore up a few of my instincts around, financial modeling and around sort of just general business acumen. And that's when I decided to go to business school at Berkeley. And I went to Haas. I actually did that while at Google. And similar, I focused on learning as much as possible at Berkeley. So I 100% took classes that I never took at Whitman. So I took corporate finance, new venture finance, every area that I felt I hadn't had exposure to at CBS or Google, I tried to round out while at Berkeley. And it was after business school and after working at Google that I then moved to Cherubic Ventures as a partner here in San Francisco. At Google, we talked a lot about something called an aha moment. The executive leadership would say, what was your aha moment, when you worked with a client and brought them, great results? Or what was your aha moment when you decided to switch teams? So I'm going to use that language and framework here. My aha moment about wanting to move into venture capital was when I stopped after business school and reflected on when I was happiest at Google, what roles I found myself naturally gravitating to, in what areas I felt challenged, in what moments of my 8-year career there did I feel restless, and what motivated me. And, sometimes you just kind of go through the motions with your job and you come home cranky or frustrated, or you come home feeling really excited and energized. But it's not often that I at least would stop to think why. And I found that that was a really, really valuable exercise in helping me improve my self-awareness about why I was excited certain days and why I was low energy other days, and on what teams I performed better and on what teams I performed worse. And that reflection led me to a few observations. One, I continued at Google, not consciously at all, working with entrepreneurs. I found myself continuing to want to work with them somehow. So on my new business development team, I was always working with early stage founders at the time. Now it sounds silly to talk about Uber as early stage, but I really enjoyed working with these small companies. And I continue to seek out naturally opportunities to work with entrepreneurs through this mentorship program with Black Box Connect. The other thing I observed of myself is I enjoyed working on the small scrappy teams while at Google. Google is a big company and there's lots of different teams, almost like there's hundreds of companies within one. And I always found myself wanting to apply for the teams that were small and growing and fast paced. I also observed I was restless kind of easy, and I always wanted a new challenge. So I was always talking to my manager about, can I take on that project? Is there a new increased scope that I can add to my plate next quarter? What else can I be doing? And then the last thing I noticed is that I really enjoyed and thrived in high risk, high reward comp structures. At Google, like I said, there's lots of different teams. There's also lots of different comp structures. You know, there's folks who are on different bonus structures. I always preferred the team that had lower salaries and higher quarterly comp, because I appreciated the ability to influence my outcomes. I liked having control and the opportunity to work hard and see the reward. So all of that led me to sort of realize, well, this in some ways described early stage investing. You know, working on small teams versus large teams led me to a smaller firm versus a larger firm. Working closely with the entrepreneurs led me to early stage investing versus later stage investing. And in some ways, as a generalist firm, I am constantly faced with an uphill learning curve. You know, we invest in all types of companies: hardware, software, enterprise, consumer. So I am constantly learning about new industries, which can be challenging and really hard at times, but it was a quality I observed in myself at Google, and one that I've carried into my role at Cherubic. So to get a little bit more tactical, it's like, okay, so how did you get there? What is the path into venture capital? Um, I hate to say it, but there is not one path. It's super messy, and almost every investor colleague that I have and every person I interviewed informationally when at business school and while at Google told me a different story about how they got there, which was really frustrating, to be honest with you. It was frustrating to hear that some people fell into it and other people pursued what seemed like traditional paths, but there really was no traditional path because the story was never repeated. What I found is it did fall into at least some of these categories. You know, there were some investors who were previous founders of very successful startups and then became investors. There were investors who started as angel investors who, you know, were able to get their hands on a small amount of cash and would make a few small angel bets that turned very successful, and then they are now working at really large VC firms. There are some investors that I've met who were early stage employees at startups like Pinterest or at Airbnb, and now they're investors today. There's people like myself who are at large companies at Google or Facebook in an operating role, and now as an investor. And then there's also domain experts, like they're scientists. They you know, worked in energy and now they're investing at a firm. And so while this is really frustrating because it's not cookie cutter, in many ways it's flexible and allows you to sort of try on different hats and find the path that is most fitting for you. And I leave these question marks because this is not a conclusive path into venture capital. There's lots of different paths that I perhaps haven't mentioned today and haven't even been exposed to myself. But what I will say is I would encourage everyone to feel as natural and authentic as possible in pursuing that path. So for example, don't overcorrect and start a company to pivot eventually into venture capital. That's not a takeaway I want to leave you with today. Of course, start a company if you're passionate about a problem, if you have a unique and unfair way of solving it. Don't join an early stage company to pivot into venture capital, but definitely join an early stage company if you feel aligned with the founders, motivated by the vision. Those are really, really good reasons. And know that that can take you to venture capital, but you want to pick the path that's authentic to you. And that can be hard when you're graduating from school and not sure what's authentic to you, which is why I would recommend to you, try on lots of different hats to get that answer. So for me, I knew when I graduated, I wanted to work at Google. I can't explain why, but I wanted to work there. I applied there right out of school. I got to the very last stage of the interview process and I didn't get it. And so I worked at CBS and I was frustrated, and I did well at CBS and I applied again and I got in, the second time a few years later in 2010. But I knew I wanted to work at a big company and I knew I wanted that company to be Google. So that's where I started. That was where I started on the path to venture capital. And then to getting to venture capital, it was a series of bottoms up and top down reflections and analysis. And so I wanted to share some of those tactical tips with you. So if you could draw your eye to the bottom left corner, I'll start with what that bottoms up process looks like, and then we can move to the top down. Before you get to concluding you want to move into venture capital and start reaching out to folks for interviews, I would start with a personal audit and ask yourself really silly, basic questions. What makes me happy? What type of work excites me? When am I bored? When am I at my best? When am I at my worst? And then I would try, and then try some more. Collect as much data as possible on your likes and dislikes. This is what venture capital is, right? It's pattern recognition. It's collecting data and seeing patterns to help you make informed decisions for the future. And you really want to do that for yourself. You owe your career, you owe it to your career to do that. So try on different hats. Try on large teams, small teams, technical teams, financially oriented teams, big company, small company, whatever it is. You just want to collect data and then reflect on how it makes you feel and how it makes you perform. Then I would ask yourself, where on the path to venture capital do you feel most at home, right? Are you like me? Do you have like this inkling, like I want to work at an early stage company. That's just me. I like the scrappiness. That's what I want. Or did you feel like there's a brand that you admire and you want to be a part of that brand? Or do you have access to capital and want to just start writing checks, and you feel like you've got good instincts and a good network of early stage founders coming out of school that you want to bet on? But I would look at that path and say, where do you see yourself following to get to venture capital? And then I would step it up and ask yourself an even harder question. Why venture? What draws me to it? And where do I still have questions? So after you've done that bottoms up analysis, then I would, bring your eye over to the top right here. Then I would start with the top down. Map the venture landscape. PitchBook is a good resource for this, where you can segment the firms by size and geo and vertical. Drill down next into the areas that interest you, right? So, you might have an affinity for enterprise businesses, so perhaps you focus on enterprise firms. And then start reading partner profiles, their Medium posts. VCs talk a lot, and we post about it and we write. And that's a wonderful data to inform your decisions on which firms resonate with you. So read those partner profiles, read what's on their website and their Medium posts, then start following those firms and partners directly, either on LinkedIn or Twitter. And usually that's where you'll get some interesting opportunities to perhaps join webinars that they're hosting, where they're talking about tips and tricks for their portfolios. They'll sometimes make those available for you to join and learn. But I would try to join as many of these virtual events as possible to just get a feel for what firms you like, what size firm, what focus areas, and actually like what partners and, the types of people they are. Because at the end of the day, these are people you're working with. And then after you've done this bottoms up, top down analysis, I would then look at your LinkedIn. Okay, and ask yourself, where do I have shared connections and who can I start to have an informational interview with? Some do's and don'ts of informational interviews I wanted to walk you through because if you're anything like me, you might be really eager and want to dive in head first, and you're like, I've already got a connection at a firm, I'm just going to reach out. My recommendation is not to do that and go through the bottoms up, top down process first, and then keep some of these do's and don'ts in mind. So some of the do's: read as much about a firm and their portfolio and that investor before you meet with them. Go in educated. Prepare thoughtful and specific questions based on your understanding of their background. Next, think through what startups and industries excite you. Be prepared to have an opinion. Be prepared to have a casual coffee chat about different consumer behaviors or trends in the market. And you want to have a fruitful discussion, and that comes with some preparation and, like I've said many times, reflection. And if possible, bring them a startup that would fit their investment thesis. Things to avoid: asking questions of someone you meet that you could answer through some basic research on your own, or requesting a meeting prematurely before you've done this exercise that I've recommended and have reflected and asked yourself why venture and what's interesting to you. And most importantly, I would avoid, if possible, talking at a high level about industries or deals you're not familiar with or well researched on. Either prepare or don't bring it up at all. And then after these informational interviews, here are some things to keep in mind in terms of closing the deal and officially making that leap into venture. As I said in the beginning, there's no one path, which is tough. And also, venture is always and never hiring. This is what I heard when I was in business school. And as I've mentioned before, it was frustrating, but also just forced me to shift my mindset, is that there might not be a job board, there might not be a season, but I need to be constantly researching and educating myself so that when the opportunity presents itself, I can have a really fruitful discussion with the firm. Foster relationships, keep in touch and share startups and deals with folks you meet after these informational interviews. And another tip to keep in mind is when firms announce new funds, it can be a good time to reach out. This is typically when they have the capital to add a few more associates or VPs or principals to their firm. So that's a good thing to track on like Google Alerts to see when these funds announce their new close. And think critically about why you at that firm, what value do you bring? And if possible, share that value generously before a role even exists to apply for, so that when a firm is ready to add to their investment team, they might think about James. James is a really bright young star who has a lot of conviction in this area and seems to have a strong network of entrepreneurs, and we should bring him in to interview. But they won't think of someone like James unless that relationship has been fostered authentically and effectively beforehand. I will leave everyone with this one thought, which I heard early in my career, and I want to pass on to you because I feel like it's super helpful. But someone once told me to always ask yourself, are you running to your next job or away from your existing one? And this, to me, has been a really good litmus test for, am I really excited about this opportunity, Or am I simply just frustrated with my existing circumstances and want to make a change? And you guys are working hard and in school, and this is a really interesting time to join the workforce. You owe it to your career to be thoughtful and honest. And, sometimes you'll be in a job you don't like and you're just looking for a new change of scenery. And it might be tempting to switch jobs, but if you're not actually running to that next job, but instead trying to escape an existing one, I would encourage you to sit tight because you deserve to be doing things that are challenging and interesting to you. And sometimes it's just best to wait and prepare before finding it. So I'll leave it at that and then happy to answer any questions you have and get a little bit more specific.
Great. Thanks so much, Danielle. Danielle, that was awesome. I really like seeing like the tactical sort of trek from the left side of that all the way over. Definitely sort of helps frame this conversation, and appreciated hearing about your career as well, spanning CBS and then Google and in that process. So thank you. Excited to sort of move into the question phase here. And I'll start with one from Lauren, which is, can you go into more depth about how you landed your jobs at CBS and Google and how you got through the Google interview process as an art history major?
Sure. So I will start with how I got my job at CBS and then go to Google. So before CBS, actually, I was at a local news station called Cron 4. And I will give you a very honest answer how I got that job. I applied to just about anything and everything after school. I actually didn't know what I was applying for when I was applying, but it was a really hard time to get a job in 2008. And I just needed one because I wanted to move out of my parents' house and live with a girlfriend. And so I was looking for jobs that were hiring and sales and for whatever reason, the TV stations were hiring and they were hiring sales and production people. And I just blanket interviewed and blanket applied and got a job at Cron 4, which is a local TV station in San Francisco.
I think, Danielle, can you hear me? I think you cut out. Hopefully this is a temporary issue.
And I worked really hard there for about a year. And after a year, I didn't matter, especially at a company like Google. They really like diversity of thought and background and intellect.
I think you cut out. I think your internet kind of lagged for a second there. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Sorry. Can you restart where you were going? Because we lost you about midway through your answer.
Sure. And what was the last thing you heard?
It started getting choppy. So I heard that you you applied to everything, and then that was kind of where it started cutting out.
Sure. So at my first job out of school purely was out of luck. I applied to as many jobs as possible, and for whatever reason, sales and production were hiring in television. And so I applied and I got offered a job and I took it because I needed to pay the rent so I could move out of my parents' house and live with a girlfriend. And to be totally transparent, I didn't enjoy it. It was really hard in many ways looking back. It was somewhat of a toxic environment. But I put my head down and I worked really hard and I took that experience to CBS because they were considered a competitor to the station. So they liked poaching from competitors. So I applied, got the job, and worked there for a year. So that's how I got the job in television. Now at Google, being an art history major actually had no negative impact on my job candidacy there. Google very much enjoys hiring people with diversity of background and thought. And so it was not brought up in any way, in any negative light at least. But the job I applied for at Google was basically an account executive job, which is what I was doing at CBS. And to be totally honest with you, I didn't want to get that job. I just wanted to work at Google. I really, really wanted to work there, but I knew that I could do that job because I was doing it at CBS. And so I applied and I got the job very, very quickly. The interview process for me was quite short, and that's because I was applying with 2 years of experience and quite a bit of domain expertise. And as a new grad, Google hires a lot. There's a lot of fantastic new grad job opportunities. And to be totally honest, your major doesn't really matter. I think they're just looking for bright people who have something, who meet their criteria of being googly, a strong leader, um, role related knowledge, which might not be as relevant for a new grad, but basically, do they think you can do the job? And the last area they hire against is something called general cognitive ability, GCA, which is just your ability to demonstrate strong critical thinking. It's not necessarily the scary interview questions around like how many ping pong balls can you put into a school bus. They just want to see that you can think critically. So as a new grad, what you're majoring in my opinion, doesn't affect your candidacy at Google, especially if you're applying for one of the more general new grad positions.
Awesome. Thank you. That's good to hear. And definitely nice to know that we're like college students won't be ruled out based off of their major background. So thank you. That's I like that feedback. And the next question is, could you tell us more about what the interviewing process for VC is like in your experience and in sort of in a general sense?
Yeah, so my leap into venture was very serendipitous, and that actually has, what I've heard, been the case for most of my colleagues too. So the interview process, I don't have a good answer on because I didn't go through an interview process. I did the whole reflection and bottoms up, top down thing that I shared with you all today. And I did make some mistakes. I did have meetings prematurely. I did talk about industries I wasn't well researched on. So this is why I was telling you, please don't do that. But for me, what ended up happening is I spoke to a lot of firms. I was introduced to them through shared connections. And the interview process was less of a process and more of a conversation, right? What are you interested in? What areas excite you? What is your opinion on the future of XYZ industry? Right? Similar to Google, I feel like a lot of these firms just want to assess how you think. Where do you have conviction? So there's no proper way to prepare, in my opinion, outside of being like reflective on what you're interested in and having an informed and unique opinion on the state of an industry or the trends in consumer behavior or like an evolving landscape, because your interviews might just be coffees that turn into job offers. Mine was a breakfast that turned into a job offer. That's what it was. I got introduced to a firm through an entrepreneur, and we had breakfast, and breakfast lasted 4.5 hours. And the breakfast was just us talking about why I liked to work with entrepreneurs. And as you saw through the slides, I at that point had done a lot of reflection and I had good answers. And it wasn't so much I was answering an interview question, I was just drinking my coffee, having my breakfast, and talking why I gravitated toward entrepreneurs, how I helped them, what roles that I do at Google that brought me closer to the startup community, and what I thought founders needed and how to best support them. These were the questions I was answering authentically and naturally, and it turned into Cherubic asking me to join as a partner to lead their US operations 2.5 years ago. I don't think I would have successfully secured that job if I was being insincere about talking about my opinion on a certain industry that I actually hadn't thought critically about. I was successful because I was really honest with my interest areas. I had a lot of experience thinking about and was really thinking about entrepreneurs, was passionate about it. And most importantly, I felt a great deal of chemistry with Cherubic. When I was talking to them, what they needed and what I could offer them felt truly compatible. And so the interview process, as I've said before, might just be a coffee chat, but it could last 4 hours. So take that time to think about your experience and what you're passionate about so that you can go from coffee to breakfast to lunch.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love how you sort of reflected on that and were prepared to have that long of a conversation. I think that definitely resonates to sort of know where you're at, know your skills, and then be ready to sort of have that conversation. However casual it is, it can be super helpful, like you're saying. So be ready in those conversations. We were talking about that earlier today in a smaller group about like being prepared for these types of interactions, whether they're on Zoom or they're in person. So yeah, absolutely. And then moving on to this next question, um, to sort of bring it back to college here. Jennifer's asking if you could go back to college, what would be the one piece of advice that you could that you would like to share with yourself at that age?
Well, you're asking me at a time when I'm stuck at home with 2 kids under 3. So, my advice would be have more fun. Um, you know, uh, it's a really beautiful thing to just learn for a living. There's such a rare time in your life when you're responsible only for yourself and you're responsible only to your own intellect, right? So, if classes seem stressful and the work seems like a lot, you know, enjoy it, I guess. Just sort of appreciate it for what it is because it is such a gift to be burdened with just learning and no other responsibility, which I'm fortunate I didn't have. I wasn't sending checks home, so I appreciate that might not be everybody's circumstance. But my dad used to always say, slow down and enjoy your surroundings because it goes very, very fast.
Yeah, that's great advice. It is such a unique time, right? Like where you can just learn and that's your focus. And I definitely can back you up on it going fast because I'm already in my last year and it feels like I just got here. So absolutely, slow it down and then enjoy it. Those are things that I think most college students can benefit from thinking about. Uh, this next question is back to your time at Google, and the question is: you mentioned getting far in the interview process when you first applied to Google. What would you say made you such a strong candidate as a recent grad out of college?
Um, I had strong grades. I did have strong grades. I think that might have contributed. I didn't do a lot of new grad hiring, but I would suspect that I made it through some general filters by having a decent academic performance and on my resume examples of leadership, right? Which I think as a new grad, it's pretty much all you can ask of yourself is strong academic performance and examples of being a leader among your peers. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated. I mean, I was a leadership in Greek life. I was a leader in theater and music. So it didn't need to fit a profile, but I think those things contributed to me at least getting my resume to the top of the pile. And then what got me through to the very last step, I think, was just having prepared for that interview. I spent hours reading Google's website. Google gives you so much information. I read literally every single page on the About Us to just get a feel for their language, get a feel for what they prioritize in their candidates. I read the job description forward and backward. And then what I did is I took the job description and my resume and I started to match, where did my experience overlap with the resume? Where did my experience overlap with the job description? And then the last thing I did is in preparing for that interview, wrote down 20 questions that I thought the interviewer might ask and had 20 examples of my leadership slash experience working in challenging situations or navigating ambiguity. This is not to say I was scripted when I interviewed. I was just prepared. I had like an arsenal, a library of examples thought through so that when the interviewer asked me a question, I would just flip through my library and I was like, right, that's my example of leadership. And I would perhaps tweak it to respond specifically to the question they asked, but I had thought about it. I had remembered the time when in Greek life there was this tension and I had to work through it with the people in my sorority and we had to make a tough decision, but I had spent the time thinking about that example. Google really loves examples. If you interview there, they might ask you half a dozen times, tell me about a time when ... Right? So have all of the moments that you are proud of polished and summarized succinctly and ready. So when you get a question, you can draw from it. And I spent a great deal of time doing that before I interviewed.
Yeah, that's very practical advice, kind of like having a catalog of these sort of moments and things that you can turn to and tweak in the moment is super helpful. So I found that to be true as well. Like having at least, I don't think I had 20 when I was interviewing, but having at least 5 to 10 scenarios that I could sort of mold and call back to. So that's awesome advice. Thank you, Danielle. Question from Alina here, which is, how would you recommend students can balance studying what they find interesting and what will help them be employable to get a well-rounded education?
Well, I was an art history major, so I to be totally honest with you, I never thought about what would make me employable beyond, you know, the more exposure to things, the more well-rounded a person I was. And that might be symptomatic of me being at a liberal arts school, right? And that's sort of what they ingrained in you. It's like they're teaching you to be a strong critical thinker. You could be a critical thinker in a psych class, in a comms class, in an econ class, in art history class, you know. And so I optimized for exposure when I was at Whitman, exposure to as many different disciplines as possible. And perhaps that's how I made that balance. Like perhaps I loved learning about art history, but I didn't want to over index in just art classes. So I would try to expose myself to different disciplines. For example, I did not have any interest in like the hard sciences because I was scared of them. And I was scared of anything with math, interestingly, as a VC, but early stage it allows you to get away with little math. But I forced myself, I was like, well, you need to have some fundamentals. So I took the econ class. I took the intro to econ class. So I had exposure to it. Now, did I do level 2 and 3 and 400? No. But I did want to have exposure to as many of those disciplines. I was never pre-med, so I didn't have this like very specific path I needed to be on or credits I needed to achieve. So, you know, maybe tactically try to integrate one class out of your, you know, one new class each semester, quarter, whatever system you're on, to just expose you to a different department.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, like you said, like making sure you're getting a lot of exposure is something that resonates for sure. And here's a question about business school. How valuable was going to business school after you worked at Google and CBS? Like, what was your sort of experience and your what are you taking away from that experience?
Going to Berkeley was incredibly valuable for me. I am on a 80-person WhatsApp group text thread every single day with my entire business school class. I am in large part successful in my job because I have that network with colleagues at very, a diverse amount of many different companies and with a diverse amount of experience that I draw on often for our founders when they want intros to, they need to get into the app store in Apple, or they want intros to an executive coach or a senior marketer. I draw on my business school network a lot to fulfill those requests and make those connections. I thought business school was really critical for me, but I went about 6 years after graduating from undergrad because, I scheduled and canceled the GMAT like 3 times in the years prior because I wasn't ready. And when I was promoted to being a people manager at Google, I concluded prematurely I didn't need business school. And then a few years after being a people manager, I reassessed and I said, no, I really want that network. And I want to shore up some of my weaknesses and improve my instincts in a few areas that I didn't get exposure to in college. So I thought it was incredibly valuable. Berkeley in particular was valuable to me because I'm here in the Bay Area. It has a strong brand, and I found that being an intangible but critical value is the brand of the school when it comes to your MBA.
Awesome. And to follow up on the business school question, the question here on sort of I guess if you could go into a little more depth on the reasoning behind going a little more in depth on why you did choose to go to an MBA at that point, and then also does Google help finance this type of education, or is that something that is always on your own?
Google, I think, gave me $12,000 a year for business school. I'm not sure what their policy is today. I think it was $12,500 for 2 years. So it was $25,000 for school, and the rest was on my own. And at the time, Berkeley was $180,000 or $160,000, I forget. So there was a big gap to close. The question of why going to business school, I was one of the youngest and I was the only female manager among my peers on the West Coast. And I felt a lot of the times alone in that. When I looked ahead at the directors and executives at Google, almost all of them had an MBA. Almost all of them at least had a Big 10 brand name on their resume. And I'm not saying this, this was a long time ago, but for me, I felt like I wanted that. Part of it, to be honest with you, is I wanted it for my own confidence a little bit. I also loved learning, right? I really loved school and I missed school. I was also an art history major and avoided like the plague, the math classes and some of the critical, fundamentals of business. And I was progressing well at Google and needed some of that foundational work I avoided a little bit at Whitman. So I wanted to learn more. I wanted to shore up some weaknesses. I wanted that for myself, for my own confidence. Nowhere did Google say you need to have an MBA. And that wasn't actually the case at all. There were dozens of executives without it, but I wanted it for myself. It was truly intrinsic. I would say for those reasons, I decided to pull the trigger and go.
Awesome. Thank you. Now a question sort of back into your experience at Google. As you spent time as a program manager for women tech makers, what advice do you have for women going into tech?
women going into tech, meaning like as entrepreneurs or as just in general working at a tech
Yeah, I
company?
think in general in STEM.
You know, I would find a community of women to work alongside. I think that's really important. When I spent some time working on that program, I actually spent time building community for the female entrepreneurs, and it was a distributed community because they were all around the world. But in these emerging markets, which is different than here, they quite literally didn't have the support even within their own household for doing something entrepreneurial. And it can be very lonely. And so we created a community to help women from like parts of Africa to Guadalajara talk about the tools they were using to be successful, the learnings they had, the resources they were exposed to best practice share and support one another. So I would recommend finding women and working with them to build your community and build your network. But you know, some of my closest friends from Google actually are men. I worked with some wonderful men in my ad sales days. And so, you know, in general, I would zoom out and say just work with people who bring out the best in you and support you and align yourself with like positive energy, right? Align yourself with positive leaders. If it's a man, great. If it's a woman, great. But in general, surround yourself with a good community of encouragement. I think is important, regardless of what industry you're joining. I think having that positive energy is really valuable.
Great, thank you. Amar is asking, how realistic is it for an undergraduate student to get into VC after they've had a VC internship?
I don't know. It's not something I'm super familiar with because our firm hasn't had in that experience with an intern then converting to like say an associate or an analyst role. So I can't really comment on that. I would like to think if you've done a good job during your internship, you've developed an upper hand in converting to a full-time contributor to that team after school. But it's not like a probability I can weigh in on because I actually don't have exposure to it. And I went into venture much later.
Speaking on your venture experience, can you give some more background on the history of Cherubic? I see they're headquartered in Beijing.
Yeah, so Cherubic is an early stage venture firm that invests in the US and Greater China. Our thesis is these are the two largest economies and venture markets in the world. So we are going to bet on both in parallel. And as an increasingly global world and interconnected world, we feel there's a lot to be learned, dots to be connected between these two markets. Matt Chang founded Cherubic 5-6 years ago. He was a serial entrepreneur who took a handful of companies public as a founding team member in Asia, but grew up here in the United States. And so he had this fascinating network where he was fluent in both business and language and cultural norms of the US and in Asia. And so he started with some angel investing, back to my windy road, as a successful early stage founder, then started with some angel investing, and then made some very, very successful early bets and institutionalized, meaning you're getting money from, you know, larger family offices, endowments, that sort of thing. And we have closed 4 funds and have about half of our portfolio here in the Bay Area and the other half in Asia. And we're vertical agnostic. So you'll see a lot of different things in our portfolio: hardware, software, consumer, enterprise. Some companies you've heard of, some you haven't. For example, we seeded a company called Calm, which is a meditation app maybe that you've used before. We seeded a company called Hims and Hers, which is a telemedicine platform and direct-to-consumer company. We seeded a company called Flexport. So there's been a lot of really fantastic companies we've had the privilege of being a part of. And really our value add is putting a global perspective on the cap table early. How do we help our founders in the United States, at least, think outside the box, have an outside of Silicon Valley perspective? And if it makes sense, how can they enter Asia, and what business model innovation and best practices and consumer behaviors can they learn from and be inspired by here in the US from our large portfolio in Asia? So that's Cherubic in a nutshell. We typically write $1 million checks pre-Series A. And like I said, vertical agnostic. We're just betting on fantastic founders in big markets.
Love it. That's awesome. Yeah, my parents are huge comm users, so that's cool to hear that you seeded them. That's awesome. And I think I'll wrap up on this final question, which is sort of like a practical skills question for college age students, and that's how can college students begin developing VC skills like the ones that you have while they're in college, while they're working in other positions and internships?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing you can do if you wanted to well, there's two things that you can do. The first one is you can make yourself a simulated fund, like a mini fund, if you will. In Excel, say you give yourself $100 and you allow yourself to write, 50 checks, $52 checks. Or you can write $101 checks, or you can write, 30 checks and then save $70 to what we call follow on, like double down on your winners, right? That's typically what we do in venture. And start tracking companies. Just read TechCrunch or Crunchbase or whatever it is. And when you see a company you're interested in, give it $1 and set up a Google alert for it and watch it. And then just start asking, asking yourself, would you give it more than $1? Would you give it 5 of your $100, 10 of your $100? And over time, track your own track record, right? Do you feel like you've got a hunch? Do you have a good instinct? Are you strong at evaluating companies? Now, it might be hard for you to do that early stage because usually by the time they hit the news, they've raised their seed round. So say you're doing this as a pretend Series A investor, but pick a vertical you're interested and start tracking it and start making simulated bets. Then second thing I would recommend you do is start writing, right? Write on Medium, write on LinkedIn about your opinion on a specific space that interests you, right? Force yourself to sit down and think critically about consumer behavior and market dynamics. Like, what's happening right now? Everybody's home. So what does this mean for, the future of work, as this is very popular right now? And what does this mean for the future of education and how our consumer behavior is going to change? So write and track companies while you're in school, and it'll help give you develop your instincts and your pattern recognition and give you some feedback on how well you're doing.
That's a great response and awesome sort of practical advice that we can all use and start to play around with. So Danielle, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your presentation, your career trek, advice, and then a lot of great responses and sort of actionable things that we can do as college students who are interested in VC. So
Sure.
really appreciate you taking the time today with 2 young kids nonetheless.
Yes, of course. Thank you guys. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Danielle.
Sure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. And to everyone else tuning in, thank you so much for joining on YouTube Live. We have a session tomorrow with Sumitra on pursuing a career in analytics and business intelligence. So definitely stay tuned, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us on our different social media channels. I will share them on the screen. But thanks so much for joining, and looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Goodbye.